Three horror stories. The mysterious temple of Angkor. Based on real stories. Story 1. Ancestral Whispers. The price of plunder at Angkor. What the curse began with a whisper, a murmur so soft that at the time, I thought it was merely the wind threading through the ancient stones of Angkor Wat. Now I know it was a warning. The first of many I ignored in my greed. My name is Liam Chen. I was an archaeologist once, at least that's how I presented myself. The truth, which I now confess as shadows close in around my room, is that I was nothing more than a thief. A plunderer of ancient treasures who believed history had a price, and that I could put it up for sale. I don't know how much time I have left. The viscous liquid now seeps down the walls, forming Khmer symbols identical to those I saw in the temple. I've managed to make this recording only because the things pursuing me seem to want me to confess before they take me. So here is my confession, my testimony, my epitaph. Cambodia's air hung thick as molasses when we arrived in December 1990. The humidity clung to skin like a second layer, mingling with sweat and the feverish excitement that precedes a significant heist. Marcus, Xiang, and I were an efficient team, each with our specialties, united by our willingness to cross moral boundaries for the right price. Marcus was ex-American military, a retrieval specialist, as he called himself. Tall, with a scar cutting across his chin, he had the kind of gaze that always seemed to be calculating escape routes. Xiang was our local contact, a middle-aged Cambodian who promised knowledge of every nook and hidden passage in Angkor Wat. As for me, I was the identification expert, the only one who could distinguish a 12th century relic from a modern replica. Our arrival coincided with the Festival of Lights, a deliberate strategy. The commotion and thousands of tourists offered the perfect disguise. The statuettes are in a sealed chamber behind the main sanctuary, Xiang explained as we analyzed maps in our cheap hotel room in Siem Reap. The monks rarely visit that part. It'll be like taking candy from a baby. A chill ran down my spine when he said that. It wasn't the first time we'd looted historical sites, but there was something different about Angkor Wat. The photograph of the temple that Xiang had spread across our improvised bed seemed to pulse under the yellowish room, light as if it had a heartbeat of its own. "This place is over 900 years old," I commented, tracing the outline of the towers in the photograph. "Have you ever stopped to think about how many emperors, monks, and kings have walked those corridors?" Marcus let out a short laugh. "Please, Jen, let's save the sentimentality for after we're rich." Xiang remained silent, his eyes avoiding mine when I mentioned the ancient kings. It was just a brief moment. But now, as I await my fate, that memory stands out as the first ignored warning. Our first night at Angkor Wat was spent reconnoitering. We blended in with tourists, pretending to be just another group of travelers, admiring Khmer architecture. I carried a professional camera as a disguise, taking occasional photos while mentally mapping the least guarded paths. It was when I photographed the inscription that everything began. The carving was almost hidden, above the entrance to a less frequented passage. Ancient Khmer letters, sculpted into the stone with supernatural precision. My camera flash briefly illuminated the symbols, and at the exact moment the shutter closed, I heard the first real whisper. "Sakum pre vea here kanyom." I turned sharply, but there was no one nearby except Xiang, who was watching a group of monks in the distance. "Did you say something?" I asked. "No," he replied, frowning. "Why?" I shook my head, dismissing the question. What does this inscription mean? Xiang looked at where I was pointing, and his face momentarily hardened. Just religious nonsense, nothing important. Later I discovered the translation through my own. Means, who violates the secrets of the gods shall be condemned for eternity. The second warning. The night of the operation came 2 days later. We waited until 2 a.m. when even the night guards would be less alert. The sky was moonless, covered by dense clouds that seemed to swallow the stars. The darkness was almost complete as we moved along the outer perimeter, avoiding the patrol routes we had mapped. The temple seemed different at night. During the day, Angkor Wat was majestic, imposing, but still just an ancient human construction. In darkness, it seemed alive, breathing. The shadows moved in ways that didn't correspond to our movements or our flashlights. The sound of our steps echoed in empty corridors, returning distorted, as if other footsteps were responding to ours. "This is it," whispered Xiang, stopping before an apparently solid wall. Marcus directed his flashlight toward the surface, revealing worn reliefs that told stories of ancient battles and forgotten gods. The carved figures seemed to writhe under the oscillating light, as if trying to escape from the stone. Xiang pressed a specific sequence of symbols on the frieze. With a muffled creak, a section of the wall yielded, revealing a narrow passage. The air that escaped was cold and carried an odor of ancient incense mixed with something more primitive, damp earth and decomposition. "Don't turn on the flashlights until we're inside," instructed Xiang. "The walls are thin here. The light could be seen from outside." We entered the absolute darkness, guided only by the touch of hands against the cold stone. The air grew heavier, with each step filling my lungs with a sensation of weight that had nothing to do with the humid climate. The temperature dropped drastically, and my breath formed small clouds before my face when we finally turned on the flashlights. The secret chamber was small, perhaps 10 feet square. The walls were covered with exquisitely detailed reliefs, showing human figures in postures of supplication before larger beings, gods or deified kings. It was hard to distinguish. In the four corners of the room, stone pedestals supported golden Buddha statuettes, each about a foot tall. "These are the ones," I whispered, approaching the nearest statuette. When my fingers touched the cold metal, I heard the whispers again, louder this time. "Anek nu min men jea menu. Anek nu jea sophia plomakum." I instinctively recoiled. "Did you hear that?" Marcus and Xiang exchanged confused glances. "Hear what?" asked Marcus, already carefully packaging the first statuette. Voices. Someone speaking. In Khmer. Xiang visibly paled even under the yellowish flashlight. "There's no one here but us, Chen. We're at least 100 meters from any public entrance. Nobody knows about this chamber." "Then what did I hear?" "The wind in the corridors," replied Marcus, impatient. "Or your hyperactive imagination. Let's focus on the task." As we packaged the 4 statuettes in protective fabric and placed them in our backpacks, the temperature continued to drop. My fingers went numb, and my breath formed increasingly dense clouds. A sweet, putrid smell began to permeate the air, like dead flowers in stagnant water. "Are you smelling that?" I asked, covering my nose with my sleeve. "What smell?" Marcus responded, closing his backpack. But I noticed that Xiang had stopped moving, his eyes fixed on a point over my shoulder. I turned slowly, following his gaze. On the wall behind me, Where there had only been reliefs of supplicating figures, the sculptures now seemed to have changed position. The figures no longer supplicated. Their arms were extended toward me, stone fingers frozen in gestures of reaching. I blinked several times, convinced it was a trick of the shadows or the unstable light of our flashlights. When I looked again, the reliefs had returned to their original position. Or perhaps they had never changed. "Let's get out of here," I muttered, unable to control the tremor in my voice. We left the temple by the same route we had entered, moving like shadows between ancient structures. The return journey seemed longer, the corridors narrower, as if the temple itself were contracting around us. Our breath and footsteps were the only sounds until, as we passed through the main courtyard, a metallic and rhythmic sound began to echo behind us. Clang, 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 like metal boots on stone. "Guards," whispered Marcus, his hand instinctively moving to the weapon concealed under his jacket. Xiang shook his head, eyes wide with terror. The guards wear rubber shoes, silent. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was approaching, each beat reverberating louder than the previous one. We saw no flashlight beams, no sign of people approaching. Just that metallic, relentless sound. "Run," ordered Xiang, all pretense of stealth forgotten. We ran through the temple complex like hunted animals, our heavy backpacks pounding against our backs with each step. The metallic footsteps continued, never accelerating, but somehow always maintaining the same distance, as if toying with us. When we finally reached the forest beyond the temple perimeter, I noticed the sky was changing. Darkness was giving way to an unnatural twilight, not the golden light of morning, but a blood-red glow that seemed to emanate from the earth itself rather than the horizon. Clang, clang, clang. The metallic footsteps ceased as soon as we crossed the invisible line separating the temple grounds from the surrounding forest. We leaned against trees, panting, our clothes stuck to our bodies by the cold sweat of fear. "What the hell was that?" demanded Marcus, his usual composure finally shaken. Xiang just shook his head, murmuring words in Khmer that I couldn't understand. His gaze was distant, as if he were seeing something beyond the physical forest around us. "Let's get back to the city," I said, adjusting the weight of my backpack. "We'll discuss this when we're safe." None of us mentioned what we heard or what we felt as we walked along the trail leading to the main road, not even when the mist began to form around us. A dense and unnatural fog that didn't reflect the light of our flashlights, but seemed to absorb it. Not even when we began to hear the whispers again, now coming from the fog itself. Ancient voices, speaking in unison, words I didn't understand but that somehow made my bones resonate with deep ancestral terror. We reached the inn in Siem Reap at dawn, but the rising sun didn't bring the comfort we expected. Even inside our room, with the curtains drawn and the statuettes hidden under the loose floorboards, the sensation of being watched persisted. Marcus was the first to show signs. That same afternoon, he woke from a nap screaming about men in golden armor watching his sleep from the corners of the room. His skin was feverish to the touch and his eyes couldn't focus on us when we tried to calm him. "They're here, because of what we took," he muttered repeatedly, his eyes scanning the room for invisible pursuers. "They won't leave until we get what we deserve." At first, we attributed his delusions to exhaustion, or perhaps some tropical disease. Xiang brought a local doctor, an elderly man with gentle eyes who carefully examined Marcus. The diagnosis was vague: fever of unknown origin, And the treatment, a mixture of modern antibiotics and traditional Khmer herbs, seemed to have no effect. Marcus's fever only intensified during the night. He alternated between periods of feverish delirium, when he spoke rapidly in a mixture of English and, surprisingly, phrases in ancient Khmer that he shouldn't have known, and moments of terrifying lucidity. In one of these moments of clarity, he gripped my wrist with surprising strength, his eyes finally focused and determined. "It's real, Chen," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "The curse. Kings dead for centuries are coming to get us, one by one." "It's just a fever, Marcus," I tried to reassure him, but my voice betrayed my own uncertainty. He smiled then, a smile that didn't belong on his face, too wide, stretching in an impossible manner. "You'll understand soon. You'll see what I see now." His eyes drifted to something behind me, over my shoulder. Instinctively, I turned to look, but there was nothing there, except the empty wall of the room. When I turned back to Marcus, his eyes were glazed, fixed on the ceiling. "The Khmer Kings have come for me," he whispered. "Don't fight when they come for you. It makes everything harder." Those were his last coherent words. In the following hours, his condition worsened dramatically. The skin around his eyes darkened as if being consumed from within. A sweet putrid smell, the same smell we sensed in the temple chamber, emanated from his body. Xiang and I took turns keeping vigil, applying cold compresses to his forehead while trying to convince ourselves that it was just a natural, explicable disease. Our denial was like a blanket too thin to protect us from the cold truth. On the third night after our theft, Marcus's transformation reached its climax. Around 3 in the morning, I awoke from an uneasy nap to find Xiang shaking my shoulder urgently. "He's different," he whispered, his face a mask of terror. "Look." Marcus was sitting perfectly upright in bed, his movements mechanical, as if he were a marionette controlled by invisible strings. More disturbing was his face. The familiar features of the man we knew were there, but something else as well, as if another face were trying to emerge from his, distorting his skin like malleable clay. His eyes, once light blue, were now completely black, with no differentiation between iris and pupil. When he saw us watching him, he smiled again, that impossible, inhuman smile. "The kings are impatient," he said, in a voice that wasn't his, but a chorus of overlapping whispers. "The first payment will be collected now. What happened next still visits my nightmares." Marcus's skin began to move, undulating like the surface of a disturbed lake. Small protuberances appeared beneath his epidermis, as if something were trying to force its way from inside out. He didn't scream, didn't show pain, just continued smiling as his body contorted. A dark, viscous liquid began to flow from his eyes, nose, and mouth. Not blood, but something older, more primitive. The sweet, putrid smell became unbearable, making Xiang run to the bathroom, overcome by nausea. I remained paralyzed, unable to move or look away as Marcus's body literally dissolved before my eyes. The black substance continued to flow, forming a thick puddle at the foot of the bed. Within that puddle, I could discern moving shapes, as if miniature soldiers were marching inside the liquid, their tiny spears held high in triumph. By the time Xiang returned from the bathroom, nothing remained of Marcus except empty clothes on the bed soaked by the viscous liquid, which now began to recede, flowing into the very pores of the wooden floor. "What happened?" asked Xiang, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where is he?" "They took him," I replied mechanically, my mind refusing to fully process what I had witnessed. "The kings came for him, like he said they would." Xiang didn't last much longer. The morning after Marcus's dissolution, he began to exhibit strange behaviors. The first sign was when I found him on the room's veranda, murmuring to himself in ancient Khmer, a language he had admitted to not knowing beyond a T. Few ritual phrases. When I asked what he was saying, he looked at me with eyes that no longer seemed entirely his own. "It's not me who's speaking," he replied in perfect English, another alarming sign, as his English had always been rudimentary. "It's them speaking through me, preparing me." "Preparing you for what?" His gaze became distant, as if observing something beyond the visible horizon. "For the second payment." Xiang's metamorphosis was different from Marcus's, but equally disturbing. Instead of dissolving, he began to fragment. Small cracks appeared in his skin, like fine porcelain subjected to intense heat. From within these fissures, a golden light pulsed, escaping in thin beams that cut through the dimness of the room. Throughout the day, he alternated between periods of catatonia and frenzy, when he recited entire passages of what appeared to be Khmer religious texts. In his moments of diminishing lucidity, he begged me to destroy the statuettes. "Return them to the temple," he pleaded, grabbing my shirt with hands that no longer seemed entirely solid. "Perhaps they'll still accept their restitution as penance." I seriously considered his advice, even going so far as to unearth the artifacts from their hiding place under the floorboards. But upon seeing the gleaming gold reflecting the setting sunlight, my greed prevailed over my fear. 4 solid gold statuettes from the 12th century, each worth a fortune. I couldn't bring myself to give them up. That was my fatal mistake. That night, the cracks in Xiang's skin multiplied and widened. He showed no pain, only a serene resignation, as if he had finally accepted his fate. The light emanating from his fissures grew brighter, filling the room with a golden radiance that didn't illuminate the corners, but seemed to intensify the shadows. "Don't fight when they come for you," were his last words before the cracks joined in a complex network covering his entire body. "It makes everything harder." With a sound like shattering crystal, Xiang disintegrated, not into physical fragments that fell to the floor, but into shards of light that ascended like incandescent particles, passing through the ceiling as if solid matter offered no resistance. In seconds, nothing remained of him except his empty clothes and a persistent echo of his last words in my mind. The second payment had been collected. I am alone now, locked in this hotel room recording this testimony. I know I will be next, the third and final payment for our desecration. The signs have already begun to manifest. Last night, as I looked in the mirror, I noticed that my reflection took a fraction of a second to match my movements. This morning, I discovered that my shadows, yes, plural, move independently of me, twisting on the walls like separate entities. The air around me has become viscous, resisting my movements as if I were moving through thick water. And the whispers never stop now. Hundreds of voices speaking simultaneously in ancient Khmer, narrating something that sounds terrifyingly like instructions for a ritual of which I will be the central focus. The walls of the room have begun to perspire that same black, viscous liquid that consumed Marcus. The substance runs down the wall, forming not random puddles but precise Khmer symbols. I tried to translate some with my limited knowledge of the language. The portal opens. The third comes now. The final sacrifice will complete the circle. The statuettes we stole, which I kept with me even after Marcus's dissolution and Xiang's disintegration, have changed too. The golden metal no longer shines. It has become opaque, absorbing light instead of reflecting it. And each time I look at them, the serene expressions of the Buddhas seem to have subtly altered, their smiles becoming wider, more knowing. Yesterday evening, I swore one of them turned its head to follow me as I walked around the room. I know now that there is no escape. There is no place in this world where I can hide from the Khmer Kings and their spectral soldiers. The only possible redemption would be to return the statuettes, but I feel it's already too late for me. The curse has marked me, claimed me. Can hear the metallic footsteps again climbing the stairs of the inn. Clang, clang, clang. The same sound we heard in the temple. There are no guards wearing metal armor in Siem Reap in 1990, but that doesn't prevent the sound from approaching. Inexorable. The sweet, putrid smell has intensified, almost unbearable. The black liquid flows more rapidly down the walls now, the Khmer symbols glowing with their own unnatural light. My reflection in the mirror above the dresser is no longer me. Or rather, it is me, but transformed. My skin has acquired the texture of ancient stone, with moss and lichen growing in, the creases and wrinkles. My eyes, once brown, now shine with the same golden luminescence that consumed Xiang. When I open my mouth, I don't see teeth, but small Buddha statuettes aligned like silent sentinels. The metallic footsteps have stopped outside my door. I hear no knocking. They don't need to announce their presence when they're already inside. My mind, watching through my eyes. The third payment will be collected soon. If anyone finds this recording, please return the statuettes to Angkor Wat. They're hidden in the false bottom of my suitcase, under the bed. Don't touch them directly. Use consecrated fabric, something blessed. Don't look at the faces of the statues for too long. The lock on the door is slowly opening, though I see no key entering. The doorknob turns by itself. The Khmer Kings have come for me as they promised. I won't fight. It makes everything harder. Recording found in room 237 of the Lotus Flower Inn, Siem Reap, Cambodia, January 1991. Inspector Soka Rithisak paused the recording and rubbed his tired eyes. The room around him remained exactly as it had been found 3 days earlier. Ao, scene of disturbing abandonment, but with no signs of violence or struggle. The untouched bed, the windows locked from inside, the dusty recorder on the table, and, most disturbing of all, the 4 golden Buddha statuettes, arranged in a perfect square on the floor, each facing inward, as if observing an invisible point. At the center of the formation, the viscous liquid that the American mentioned in his recording had dried, leaving dark marks on the walls, Khmer symbols that, as the department translator confirmed, described not a curse, but a portal, a passage. We can't simply file this as another case of a missing tourist, muttered Soka to his assistant. This is the third one in 2 months. Always foreigners trying to steal artifacts from the temple. The young assistant hesitated before responding. Sir, the temple monks, they say we shouldn't get involved. They say justice has already been served. Soka stared at the golden statuettes, feeling an unpleasant tingling in his fingers as he approached them. The afternoon light penetrating through the blinds seemed to avoid the artifacts, creating around them a nimbus of darkness that defied logic. "Do you hear that?" he suddenly asked. "What, sir?" "That whispering." The assistant shook his head, uncomfortable. "I don't hear anything, but Soka heard it. A constant murmur, like dozens of voices speaking simultaneously in an ancient language he didn't know, but somehow understood at a visceral, primordial level. The voices told stories about Khmer Kings, about justice, about portals that opened between worlds. Something about the statuettes had changed since they entered the room. The serene expressions of the golden Buddhas now seemed slightly different, their smiles more pronounced, their eyes carved in the metal somehow more aware. "Let's go," Soka abruptly decided, retreating toward the door. "Seal this room. No one enters until I return with—" His voice failed. With what? Who could handle this? What authority could comprehend what was happening here? As he walked to the door, his legs felt increasingly heavy, as if moving through thick mud. The air in the room had become dense, resistant, and that smell sweet and putrid, the same one the American described in his recording. "Sir?" His assistant's voice sounded distant now, as if coming from another world, another time. Soka tried to reach for the doorknob, but his arm seemed to move in slow motion. The shadows in the corners of the room began to thicken, to pulse, with a life of their own. From the periphery of his vision, he could discern figures forming, tall silhouettes wearing what appeared to be ancient Khmer armor, and the whispers intensified, becoming almost deafening inside his head. "The Guardian has been chosen. The cycle continues. The new Watcher will take his place." With growing horror, Soka realized he could no longer move. His feet seemed to have fused with the wooden floor. When he looked down, he saw it wasn't an illusion. His ankles were actually merging with the floorboards, as if the matter of his body and that of the wood were becoming one. "Get out," he managed to say to his assistant, his voice unrecognizable even to himself. "Get out now and, don't come back. Tell them to seal this place, to demolish this entire building if necessary." The young man didn't need to be told twice. The door slammed behind him, leaving Soka alone with the statuettes and the shadows that now moved freely around the room, approaching him with metallic footsteps that reverberated not just in the air, but inside his head, his chest, his bones. The 4 golden statuettes began to move by themselves, dragging across the floor without any visible hand to guide them. They formed a circle around his immobilized feet. From the exact center of this formation, the floor began to undulate and open, revealing not the lower floor of the inn, but a vertiginous abyss that descended far beyond the building's foundation, a vertical tunnel whose depth seemed endless, its walls adorned with the same Khmer symbols that stained the walls of the room. Soka felt his body sinking slowly, inexorably, into this well. There was no pain, just a sensation of intense cold that began at his feet and gradually rose. When it reached his chest, he realized he was no longer breathing, and more disturbing still, he no longer needed to breathe. The human-shaped shadows gathered around the hole, observing his gradual descent. Now he could see them clearly. Majestic, figures of ancient Khmer Kings, their crowns and jewels gleaming with a light that didn't belong to this world. Behind them, guards wearing golden armor stood at attention, ornate spears in their hands, faces hidden by elaborate helmets. Soka's last coherent thought before his head submerged into the abyss was a sudden, crystalline understanding. The curse wasn't about punishment. It was about recruitment. The kings weren't destroying the desecrators. They were transforming them into eternal guardians of their treasures, adding them to the ranks of sentinels who had protected the secrets of Angkor Wat for centuries. The portal closed above his head, the floor returning to its normal appearance. The golden statuettes silently returned to their original positions. 3 weeks later, tourists reported seeing a strange figure patrolling the less visited corridors of Angkor Wat. A man wearing modern clothes but moving with the mechanical rigidity of a marionette. His face, they said, seemed to be in constant transition, fluctuating between his original features and the impassive countenance of an ancient Khmer mask. The tour guides of Siem Reap added this story to their repertoire of local legends about the temple's ghost guardians, spirits that never abandon their post, even after death. As for the statuettes found in room 237 of the Lotus Flower Inn, they were duly returned to the temple by Buddhist monks who performed elaborate purification rituals. They were placed in a sealed chamber, away from visitors' eyes, protected by ancient inscriptions that warn in Khmer, "Who violates the secrets of the gods shall be condemned for eternity to guard them." The curse of the Khmer Kings isn't about death or destruction. It's about eternal service, and the cycle continues. Story 2. The Eternal Watcher. My night with the Guardian of Angkor. Wat's silence has a sound of its own. I discovered this among the ruins of Angkor Wat, when the world of the living receded, and something older emerged from the shadows. Something that never abandoned its post. Something that still walks eternally among millennial stones. My name is Thomas Reeves. I've photographed the Egyptian pyramids under moonlight, documented Mayan temples swallowed by jungle, and spent solitary nights in abandoned cathedrals of Eastern Europe. 15 years capturing the intersection between the material world and the spiritual through my lens. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I encountered in Cambodia. This isn't a story for paranormal enthusiasts or thrill seekers. It's a warning, a testimony, an epitaph for the person I was before that night when the boundary between worlds dissolved in the golden hour of twilight. National Geographic sent me to Angkor Wat for a special feature on forgotten temples of Southeast Asia. Ironically, Angkor Wat is far from forgotten. It receives over 2 million tourists annually. But the editor wanted something different, something no one had seen before. "We need new angles, Thomas," he insisted over the phone. "Everyone's already seen the classic sunrise photos reflected in the lakes. I want something that makes readers feel they're discovering Angkor Wat for the first time." My solution was simple. Photograph the complex during the golden hour of dusk and continue into twilight, when the last tourists and even most monks would have departed. Capture the temple in its purest state, when the ancient stones could breathe without the constant buzz of foreign voices. Getting special authorization was surprisingly easy. My reputation and National Geographic credentials opened doors, but there was something else, a strange willingness on the part of local authorities that, in retrospect, should have warned me. "You have permission to remain until 8 p.m., informed the site administrator, a thin man with eyes that seemed never to blink. Not a minute longer. He handed me the special pass but retained it for a moment when I tried to take it. His fingers, surprisingly cold against mine. "Stay in the main areas," he cautioned. "Some sections of the temple are not safe after sunset." "Structural issues?" I asked, thinking of unstable floors or loose stones. A thin smile stretched his lips. We could call it that. When I turned to leave, he added something in Khmer. Soft words I didn't understand, but which sounded strangely like a prayer or a request for forgiveness. I arrived at Angkor Wat at 4:30 p.m., carrying my professional equipment, 3 Nikon D850 cameras, various lenses, 2 stable tripods, and supplementary lighting if needed. The day had been absurdly hot, even by Cambodian standards, and my shirt was already soaked with sweat as I set up my main equipment near the western gate. The complex still buzzed with the last tourist groups, local guides reciting historical facts in various languages, orange-robed monks gliding silently through the crowds. I positioned myself patiently, waiting for the exodus that would inevitably occur as the sun began to set. It was during this wait that I noticed the first anomaly. While checking the white balance on one of the cameras, I accidentally captured the image of one of the temple guards in the background, a tall man wearing the standard dark green uniform. On the camera's LCD screen, his figure appeared blurred, as if he had moved during exposure. But I had used a fast shutter speed, sufficient to freeze even quick movement. I looked up to see him in person, but he had already turned a corner. I shrugged, attributing the anomaly to a temporary defect in the sensor. As the sun descended, the complex began to empty. Tourist groups flowed toward the parked buses, guides checked watches, street vendors packed their unsold products. The PO transformation was remarkable. The constant buzz of conversations gradually decreased until, around 6:15 p.m., only the occasional bird call and the soft sound of leaves stirred by the evening breeze remained. The light was simply magical. The setting sun bathed the ancient stones in amber and gold tones, creating dramatic contrast between light and shadow. The carved faces of deities and warriors seemed to come alive under that illumination, their stone eyes suddenly expressive, watchful. I lost myself completely in photography, moving from one point to another, capturing angles, textures, the play of light on millennial surfaces. I barely noticed when the last temple employee passed by me, giving me a curious look before disappearing toward the main gate. It was when the sun finally touched the horizon that I realized I was completely alone in Angkor Wat, or at least that's what I thought at the time. The sun had set, but the sky still retained a purplish glow, enough for me to work without artificial lighting. I was positioning my tripod near the western gate to capture a series of long exposures, when I noticed peripheral movement, a silhouette moving between distant columns. My first thought was practical. A guard making his final round, checking if all visitors had departed. But something in the way it moved unsettled me. There was an unnatural fluidity to its steps, as if it barely touched the ground, as if it floated rather than walked. Instinctively, I raised the camera and aimed through the telephoto lens, adjusting the focus. What I saw made me freeze. The figure was undeniably male and tall, but he didn't wear the green uniform of modern guards. Instead, he was dressed in what appeared to be ancient Khmer armor, elaborately ornamented and inexplicably golden, in a way that captured and reflected the twilight light, even several meters away. His face was hidden by an equally ornate helmet, but the sensation of being watched, of being studied, was undeniable. I took a photo by professional reflex, the click of the shutter echoing abnormally loud in the temple's silence. When I lowered the camera to look directly, the figure had vanished. I blinked several times, trying to reorient my vision. An illusion created by the peculiar twilight light, I thought. or perhaps an actor in costume for some cultural event I wasn't aware of. I checked my watch, 7:10 p.m. I still had 50 minutes before I needed to leave. I returned to work, but something had changed. The silence that had seemed peaceful now carried an oppressive quality, as if the air itself had acquired weight and presence. The temperature had also dropped perceptibly, my sweat quickly drying on my skin, replaced by a cold sensation that didn't match the tropical climate. And then I began to hear the footsteps. At first, they were almost imperceptible, a slight metallic sound against stone that could easily be attributed to the natural contraction of rocks as they cooled after the day's heat, but gradually they became more distinct. Clang, 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 a constant, deliberate rhythm of metal boots marching on ancient pavement. "Hello?" I called out in English, my voice sounding strangely muffled, as if the thick air absorbed the sound. Waves. "Is anyone there?" I tried a few words in Khmer that I had learned, a basic greeting, a question about who was there. Only silence answered, but the footsteps continued, now moving in a circular pattern around me, as if someone, or something, was encircling me, always staying out of sight, in the increasingly deep shadows. It was then that I realized something disturbing. Although I could clearly hear the metallic footsteps moving around me, I couldn't locate their origin. The sound seemed to come from all directions simultaneously, as if it existed less in physical space and more inside my own head. An unexpectedly cold gust of wind passed through me, bringing with it a strange odor, a mixture of sandalwood, ancient incense, and something more primitive, similar to freshly dug earth. The kind of smell you would find in a newly opened tomb. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Abandoning the tripod, I grabbed the main camera and began to slowly back away toward what I believed was the path to the main gate. The metallic footsteps slightly accelerated, still maintaining that measured, inexorable rhythm. That's when I saw the figure again. This time he was much closer, perhaps 20 meters away, partially hidden by a massive column. The golden armor gleamed with its own luminescence that defied the growing darkness, each engraving and ornament distinctly visible. I could discern elaborate details of dragons and garudas carved into the metal, in a style I immediately recognized as belonging to the original construction period of Angkor Wat in the 12th century. The figure remained motionless for a long moment, as if assessing me. Then, with deliberate slowness, he unsheathed a curved sword, whose blade reflected a light that had no visible source in the surrounding environment. I raised my camera instinctively, an involuntary reaction, a photographer's reflex trying to document even the inexplicable. The flash fired automatically in the low-light setting, momentarily illuminating the corridor. In the brief explosion of artificial light, I saw that the figure was now just 5 meters from me. An impossible approach in such a short time without me detecting movement. And under the ornate helmet there was no face, just a deep, impenetrable darkness where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. A darkness that seemed to absorb the flashlight rather than reflect it. I let the camera drop, hanging by its cord around my neck, and ran. My feet pounded against the ancient pavement as I fled through the temple's labyrinthine corridors. I had no idea where I was going. All the mental maps I had memorized to navigate the complex evaporated in the face of panic. I was just running, turning at random corners, climbing stairs, and then descending again. My only goal to put as much distance as possible between myself and that apparition. The metallic footsteps followed me relentlessly. They didn't accelerate to match my frantic pace, maintaining the same measured, confident tempo. The sound contrasted with my own panting breath and the deafening heartbeat in my ears. Somehow, this was even more terrifying. The implicit certainty that no matter how fast I ran, that entity would eventually catch up with me. Twilight had completely given way to night now, and a crescent moon provided only sporadic illumination through windows and openings in the ceiling. I stumbled frequently, cursing the decision not to bring a flashlight. The heavy equipment pounded against my body as I ran, leaving bruises I would only feel hours later. In my panic, I took a wrong turn. I went left where I should have gone right, and found myself at a dead end. A small inner courtyard surrounded by high walls on 3 sides. The only exit was the path through which I had entered, and in that entrance, blocking my only means of escape, stood the golden armored figure. He, for the entity had undeniably a masculine presence, remained completely still, the curved sword now sheathed again. Moonlight reflected off the armor, creating hypnotic patterns that seemed to move independently, as if the metallic surface were liquid instead of solid. I pressed myself against the opposite wall, my heart hammering so violently I thought it might fracture my ribs. Fear had frozen my voice. I couldn't scream, could barely breathe. For a long moment we remained like this, me cornered, him blocking my escape. The only sound was my irregular breathing and that annoying ticking of my watch, reminding me that time, normal, human time, continued advancing, oblivious to the impossible confrontation unfolding. It was then that the entity moved. With a fluid grace that no real armor would allow, he slowly raised a spectral hand and pointed directly at the camera hanging on my chest. The gesture was unequivocal in its command. With trembling fingers, I raised the camera, my survival instincts overriding any attachment to my work. I accessed the review menu and scrolled through the photos I had taken that afternoon. When I reached the image of the figure, captured moments before my flight, I felt something impossible. The temperature around me dropped even further, to the point where I could see my own breath condensing in the tropical air. The golden armor glowed more intensely, as if reacting to its own digital image. I understood then what was required of me. With my thumbs still trembling uncontrollably, I navigated to the deletion options and erased the photo. Then, as a precaution, I deleted all images captured after sunset. When I finished, I raised the camera, showing the empty screen to the entity. The guardian remained motionless for several seconds, as if considering my offer. A cold sigh swept through the enclosed courtyard, stirring my hair, bringing with it that same smell of sandalwood and ancient earth. Then, slowly he nodded. A gesture so profoundly human coming from a supernatural apparition that it almost provoked a hysterical laugh, the kind of sound a man on the verge of mental collapse might emit. The guardian raised his arm again, this time pointing to an opening in the wall to my right, a narrow passage I hadn't noticed before, partially hidden by shadows and sculpted reliefs. I understood the message. I was being spared but should leave immediately through that indicated path. I moved slowly away from the wall, my muscles protesting after having been so rigidly tensed. I didn't dare take my eyes off the figure as I cautiously moved toward the passage. When I reached the entrance to the dark corridor, an inexplicable certainty arose in my mind. That path would lead me outside, to safety. Before entering the passage, I looked one last time at the guardian. He remained exactly in the same position, his posture conveying not threat, but an ancestral vigilance. He was fulfilling a duty that transcended centuries, perhaps millennia. It was then that I heard him, not with my physical ears, but inside my mind. A voice that wasn't a voice, but a presence, articulating words in ancient Khmer that, inexplicably, I understood with perfect clarity. Some secrets belong to the gods. Some places must never be disturbed after the sun sets. Go and tell what you saw here, so others may know that Angkor Wat is never truly abandoned. The communication ceased as abruptly as it began, leaving a mental void that was almost physically painful. I entered the dark passage without hesitation, guided both by fear and by the supernatural certainty that this was the designated path for my escape. The corridor was narrow and completely dark, forcing me to advance blindly, hands extended touching the damp stone walls on each side. The air was saturated with the smell of mold and antiquity, but also with something else, an elusive perfume that reminded me of lotus flowers and rainwater, so different from the tomb-like smell that accompanied the guardian. After what seemed like an eternity in darkness, I glimpsed a faint glow ahead. Quickening my steps, I emerged through a small opening partially covered by vegetation. I was on the eastern side of the complex, almost directly opposite the western gate where I had left my tripod and additional equipment. The moon now shone completely, illuminating the path back to the main entrance where my driver should be waiting. I looked at my watch, 8:43 p.m. I had exceeded my permitted time by more than 40 minutes. As I hurriedly walked along the stone path, I couldn't help but look back repeatedly, half expecting to see the golden figure following me at a distance. But the temple complex remained quiet and apparently empty under the moonlight. However, I couldn't ignore the persistent sensation of being watched, not with hostility, but with a vigilant attention that would accompany me for much longer than I could imagine that night. I arrived at my hotel in Siem Reap in a near-shock state. My driver had asked questions about my delay and disheveled appearance, but I responded with monosyllables, unable to articulate or even fully process what I had experienced. In my room, I placed the camera on the table and went directly to the bathroom, where I violently vomited before collapsing under the shower, still fully clothed. The hot water gradually restored some sense of normality, anchored me back to the material, rational world. When I finally emerged, wrapped in a hotel bathrobe, I felt sufficiently centered to examine my equipment. The tripod and supplementary lighting were, obviously, lost, abandoned in my frantic flight. I would have to explain this to the National Geographic Office, invent some plausible story about a theft or accident. I picked up the main camera, the one I had used to photograph the Guardian, and that I had subsequently wiped clean of all images. I turned it on, expecting to confirm that the memory remained empty. My heart nearly stopped when I saw there was a single photo on the card. With trembling fingers, I accessed the image and enlarged it on the LCD screen. It was a perfect photograph of Angkor Wat at sunset, the kind of masterful composition that professional photographers spend careers trying to capture. The angle, the lighting, the balance between light and shadow. Everything was beyond anything I could have deliberately created, and in the lower right corner of the image, almost imperceptible unless you knew exactly where to look, was the silhouette of a warrior in armor, his helmet turned precisely toward the camera. I sat heavily on the edge of the bed, my mind struggling to comprehend the incomprehensible. There was no logical explanation for the existence of that photo. I myself had deleted all the images, and this didn't resemble any of those I had taken. It was then that I noticed the capture date in the image metadata. August 16, 1283, an impossible date, obviously a camera error. But the specific precision hit me like a physical blow. 1283, less than a century after the construction of Angkor Wat, when the Khmer Empire was still at the height of its power. I spent the entire night studying that single photograph, enlarging each section, analyzing every pixel. The image showed none of the modern restoration signs in the temple. Certain pillars that are reconstructed today appeared partially damaged, and sections that are now in ruins appeared complete and intact. It was as if the photo had really been taken centuries ago, an impossible visual record of how Angkor Wat appeared in its original glory. By dawn, I made a decision. I transferred the image to my laptop, made multiple copies on different storage devices, and then completely reformatted the camera's memory card, permanently erasing the original file. I didn't submit that photo to National Geographic. Instead, I returned to Angkor Wat the following morning, this time during normal visiting hours surrounded by dozens of tourists, and took a series of conventional but competent images that would satisfy the article's requirements. Part of me feared the Guardian would appear again even in sunlight, but the temple seemed completely normal during the day, inhabited only by tourists, monks, and regular guards in their green uniforms. If any of them noticed anything strange in my behavior, the way I constantly looked over my shoulder, how I avoided certain sections of the temple, no one commented. 10 years have passed since that night. I've never returned to Cambodia, although the impossible image remains with me, stored on an encrypted drive I always carry. I rarely look at it, but when I do, I notice that small details seem to subtly change with each viewing, as if the photograph existed in a state of continuous flux, or perhaps as if my perception of it altered as my own understanding of what I witnessed evolves. In my subsequent research on Angkor Wat, I discovered similar accounts to mine. Tourists, researchers, and even local residents who encountered what they call the Guardian in golden armor. The stories vary in details but share common elements. The metallic clanging of his footsteps, the supernatural cold that announces his presence, the sensation of being judged by something far beyond human comprehension. Local monks have their own explanation. The Guardian is not a ghost in the Western sense, but a Borome, a protective spirit designated to guard sacred places. They believe he was a real soldier during the reign of Suryavarman II, the king who commissioned the construction of Angkor Wat. So dedicated was he to his duty that even after death, he refused to abandon his post. I don't know if this explanation is true, but I find in it a strange comfort. The idea that there are forces in the world dedicated not to the persecution or torment of the living, but to the protection of what is sacred and significant. Sometimes, in moments between sleep and wakefulness, I still hear those metallic footsteps. Clang, clang, clang. The sound follows me across continents and years, not as a threat, but as a reminder. My camera never worked properly after that night. The photographs it takes occasionally contain anomalies, areas of inexplicable light, temporal distortions where moving objects appear in multiple positions simultaneously. Technicians can find nothing physically wrong with the equipment. And sometimes, in completely unrelated photographs, a wedding in Chicago, a landscape in Arizona, a studio portrait in New York, I capture something I only noticed later during editing. In the farthest corner of the frame, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding shadows, the silhouette of a man wearing an ornate helmet, watching through the lens, through time and space, directly at me. The Guardian continues his vigil, not just at Angkor Wat, but in some shadowy territory between worlds, where the boundary between past and present, between the mundane and the sacred, becomes as thin as the emulsion on an old sheet of photographic film. And I carry his message. Some places are never truly empty. Some secrets belong only to the gods. And some guardians never abandon their post, not even in the face of eternity. Note, since Thomas Reeves wrote this account in 2017, he disappeared during a photographic expedition to the Arctic Circle. His camera was found intact, containing only one image. Angkor Wat under moonlight, perfectly captured from an angle that would have been physically impossible from any position on the ground. In the center of the photograph, clearly visible, are two figures, one in modern Arctic expedition clothing, and beside him, a Khmer warrior in golden armor. Both look directly at the camera, as if deliberately posing for posterity. According to the monks at Angkor Wat, a new guardian has been added to the eternal watch over the sacred temple. Story 3. Voices in the Mist, Lost in the Forest of Angkor. Wat certain boundaries were not meant to be crossed. There are places in the world where the veil between realities has worn thin over the centuries, becoming so tenuous it's almost translucent. Angkor Wat is one such place. I learned this the hard way, when the fabric of time unraveled around me, and ancestral voices whispered secrets that should never have reached living ears. My name is Michael Herschel. I was, or used to be, an independent documentarian, specializing in abandoned sacred places. The 2021 pandemic had emptied global tourist attractions, creating a unique opportunity to capture these sites without the usual crowds. My series already featured empty European cathedrals and deserted Japanese temples. Angkor Wat would be my masterpiece. Had I known what awaited me in the shadows between those ancient stones, I would have left my camera at home and run in the opposite direction. What you're about to read isn't a conventional ghost story. It's a warning, a testimony, the confession of someone who glimpsed something existing beyond human understanding and who now lives with one foot in each world. Cambodian heat is a living entity, something that clings to your skin like a persistent lover. On that March afternoon, the humidity felt particularly oppressive, as if the air itself was saturated not just with water vapor, but with a tangible anticipation. As I crossed the western gates of Angkor Wat shortly after noon, I felt a tingling at the base of my spine, a sensation I ignored, attributing it to professional excitement. "You must leave before nightfall," instructed the site administrator when he handed me the special authorization. He was a small man, with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of ancient secrets. The stones, they remember things at night. I found the choice of words curious but nodded politely. Years documenting sacred sites had made me accustomed to local superstitions. I'd heard similar warnings from caretakers of medieval churches and guardians of Shinto shrines. It was always the same story. Don't disturb the spirits, don't stay after dark, respect the invisible boundaries. Soka, my local guide, seemed to share these concerns. though he expressed them more pragmatically. There are areas in the complex where the stones are unstable, he explained while leading me through the main courtyards. It's not safe to explore after dark. Soka was a man in his 40s, with a face that carried the traces of Cambodian history. The years of the Khmer Rouge, the reconstruction, the emergence of tourism. His eyes were simultaneously gentle and vigilant, the kind of gaze that only develops after witnessing both beauty and horror. We spent the afternoon filming the main areas of the temple. Soka was an exceptional guide, knowing angles that favored natural lighting in less frequented corridors where we could capture the true essence of the place. But when I mentioned my interest in exploring the more remote sections of the complex, something in his expression changed. Why disturb those who still pray? He asked enigmatically. I thought the monks stayed mostly in the central areas, I replied, adjusting my camera for a wide-angle shot. Soka smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. I wasn't talking about the monks you can see. Our disagreement culminated when I insisted on filming the forest surrounding the more distant temple structures. There was something about that vegetation that intrigued me. The way it moved even in the absence of breeze, how it seemed more alive, more conscious than ordinary. Forests. There are places where the past never became past, Soka warned, refusing to accompany me. You are welcome to film the temples, the sculptures, the stones, but the forest remembers. Remembers what? I asked, irritated by what I considered excessive superstition. Everything, he answered simply. Then, checking his watch, I'll be at the main gate until 5. If you don't return by then, I'll assume you found your own way back to Siem Reap. I watched him walk away, feeling a pang of remorse for my insensitivity. But the documentarian in me was determined. The forest surrounding the more distant ruins would provide the perfect contrast. Nature and civilization, growth and decay, present and past intertwined. The following hours were dedicated to capturing the temple from every possible angle. I lost myself completely in the work, in the play of light and shadow, in the carved expressions of gods and demons that seemed to change as the sun moved across the sky. It was only when the quality of light began to shift, acquiring that golden tone photographers call the magic hour, that I realized how much time had passed. The sun was approaching the horizon, painting the ancient stones with an amber glow that made the reliefs appear almost alive. I checked my watch. 5:42 p.m. Soka would have already left. Just a few more minutes, I muttered to myself, excited by the perfect lighting. A few twilight shots and then back to the city. The sunset at Angkor Wat is spectacular. A symphony of colors that transforms the temple into something almost transcendental. As the sun descended, I sensed a subtle shift in the environment. The day's heat began to dissipate, replaced by a cool breeze that carried a peculiar aroma. Not unpleasant, but strange. Sandalwood, incense, something older and more primitive I couldn't identify. The orange light gradually gave way to purple and indigo tones. I should have started my return then, but something compelled me to continue filming. There was a quality to the twilight light that seemed to reveal details in the sculptures that weren't visible during the day. Deeper, more human expressions, as if the stone figures were slowly awakening. It was only when the darkness became too deep to film without additional lighting that I realized my mistake. The temple was completely deserted. The few guards who normally patrolled the main areas had disappeared, and I was alone in a remote section of the complex. with only the faint glow of my camera screen to guide my way. I turned on the small flashlight I always carried in my equipment. The light beam seemed strangely muffled, unable to fully penetrate the darkness that now enveloped the ruins. I began walking in the direction I believed led to the main gate, trying to orient myself by the architectural landmarks I had noticed during the day. That's when I noticed the mist. It appeared not gradually, as would be natural, but almost instantaneously. A white shroud that sprouted from the ground as if being exhaled by the earth itself. Within minutes, it had completely enveloped me, reducing my visibility to less than 6 feet in any direction. The mist wasn't natural. It didn't move like ordinary fog, didn't respond to the slight breezes that occasionally passed. Instead, it seemed to have purpose, consciousness. It thickened in certain directions, as if deliberately blocking some paths while leaving others relatively clear. And within the mist, I heard the first whisper. The whisper was so soft that initially I thought it was merely the wind among the leaves. A melodic cadence, almost like a distant lullaby. But there wasn't enough wind to stir the trees that way. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding strangely muffled in the dense mist. "Is anyone there?" Only silence answered, but a silence that seemed attentive, expectant. Then gradually the whispers returned, louder this time, coming from multiple directions, simultaneously. It wasn't modern Khmer that I would recognize from the few phrases I had learned. It was something older, more formal, with a distinct ritualistic rhythm. My fingers gripped the flashlight with renewed force as I tried to discern a path through the mist. The humidity had intensified, condensing on my clothes, my equipment, my skin. The air seemed heavier, saturated not just with water, but with some intangible presence that pressed against my senses. That's when my flashlight began to fail. The light flickered once, twice before diminishing to a faint, trembling glow that barely illuminated 3 feet in front of me. I hit it against my palm, a useless gesture born of desperation. But the light only weakened further. In the growing darkness, the whispers became chanting, slow, hypnotic melodies, in a cadence that seemed to alter my very perception of time. The chanting now came from all sides, as if an invisible choir surrounded me in the darkness. Among the incomprehensible words, one phrase repeated, clear enough for me to understand. "Who hears our chanting never again belongs to the world of the living." A crystalline laugh, simultaneously childlike and ancient, echoed to my right. I turned sharply, only to glimpse a humanoid form moving among the trees. It wasn't completely solid, but neither was it completely translucent, like mist condensed into human form, dressed in monastic robes from centuries past. My flashlight finally died, plunging me into almost absolute darkness. The moon, which should have been nearly full that night, was completely hidden by the supernatural mist. The only illumination came from the spectral figures themselves, which I now perceived in the periphery of my vision. Dozens of them, moving in concentric circles around me, their ghostly luminescence offering brief glimpses of the transformed forest. Panic finally overcame my professional fascination. I stowed the camera in my backpack and began to run, orienting myself by instinct and the occasional flashes of moonlight that penetrated the mist. The chanting followed me, increasing in volume and urgency, as if my flight had intensified some invisible ritual. The trees around me seemed different now, older, more twisted. their trunks adorned with carved symbols I hadn't noticed during the day. The vegetation grew denser with each step, as if the forest itself was rearranging to block my path. After what felt like hours running in circles, I collapsed exhausted against the trunk of a gigantic tree. That's when I noticed something disturbing. All the normal sounds of the tropical forest, insects, night birds, the occasional movement of small mammals, had completely ceased. The only sound was the incessant chanting, now accompanied by a rhythm of drums that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath my feet. The mist around me began to thicken and swirl, forming an ascending spiral that resembled a slow-motion tornado. Within this nebulous column, more defined forms began to materialize, figures that seemed extracted from the bas-reliefs of Angkor Wat itself, monks in ancient robes, nobles with elaborate ceremonial adornments, Apsara dancers whose fluid movements defied the physical limitations of normal human bodies, warriors with traditional Khmer armor, ornate spears at attention, and at the center of this spectral assembly, one figure stood out, wearing a crown I immediately recognized from the temple's bas-reliefs. It was the perfect representation of King Suryavarman II, the original builder of Angkor Wat in the 12th century. The royal figure raised his hand toward me, and the chanting ceased abruptly. In the absolute silence that followed, his voice resonated with supernatural clarity. "You have come to witness what should not be seen by the eyes of the living," he spoke in ancient Khmer, but somehow I understood perfectly. "Now you must make a choice. Depart and never return, or remain and learn the secrets that have kept Angkor Wat alive for a millennium." I realized then that I had stumbled into the middle of some kind of ritual ceremony, an event that had been performed continuously, night after night, since the temple was built 9 centuries ago. A ritual that existed outside normal time, in a liminal space between the worlds of the living and the dead. I want to leave," I managed to stammer, my voice trembling uncontrollably. My response didn't seem to surprise the spectral king. He nodded slowly, as if he had anticipated my choice from the beginning. His eyes, pools of darkness that nevertheless emanated a disturbing clarity, studied my face with an intensity that seemed to penetrate beyond flesh, examining something more fundamental in my existence. "Then you must promise never to reveal what you witnessed this night," declared the king. "And you must carry a mark with you, to always remember that there are boundaries the living should not cross." Before I could respond, one of the spectral monks approached. His body seemed composed of semi-transparent mist, but his eyes possessed a disconcerting solidity. He raised a hand that appeared simultaneously material and immaterial, and touched my forehead with fingers that felt like liquid ice penetrating my skin. A sharp pain radiated from the point of contact. Not an ordinary physical pain, but something deeper, as if the sensation penetrated directly into my soul. An intense cold spread from the central point, down my face, neck, shoulders, until it enveloped my entire body in an icy embrace that paralyzed not just my muscles, but my very perception of time. The world around me began to spin, the spectral figures merging with the mist, the chanting returning, no longer audible through my ears but vibrating directly inside my skull, as if the ancient words were being engraved into the very structure of my thoughts. My last conscious vision was of King Suryavarman, his spectral form seemingly more solid than before, watching me with an expression that combined ancestral sorrow and something I can only describe as patient expectation. Then darkness completely enveloped me. I awoke to the first rays of sun touching my face, lying on the steps of the main temple of Angkor Wat. My body was stiff, muscles protesting as if I had run a marathon. My clothes were covered in dew, but inexplicably dry in places where they should have been soaked with sweat. One of the morning guards found me while making his first round. His expression of concern transformed into something close to fear when he saw my face. "You need a doctor," he said in hesitant English, helping me to my feet. "What happened?" I asked, my tongue feeling strangely numb, as if I hadn't used it for days rather than hours. The guard didn't answer directly. Instead, he took a small mirror from his pocket and positioned it in front of my face. In the center of my forehead was a mark, not a tattoo or scar, but something that seemed to exist simultaneously on and under my skin. An ancient Khmer symbol of deep black color, its contours as precise as if they had been drawn by a meticulous artist. "What does it mean?" I asked, hesitantly touching the mark. I felt no different texture under my fingers, as if the symbol were a natural part of my skin that had always existed there. The guard hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "It is ancient. Very ancient." Finally, after a tense pause, "It means the one who was spared by the ancestors." I was taken to the hospital in Siem Reap, where confused doctors performed a battery of tests. The mark didn't respond to any dermatological treatment. It wasn't ink, wasn't a burn, wasn't any known medical condition. For all intents and purposes, it was as if that symbol were a natural characteristic of my skin, as fundamental as the color of my eyes or the shape of my nose. A specialist in ancient Khmer writing was called to examine the mark. He confirmed the initial translation, the one who was spared, but added a disturbing detail. The specific symbol was a variant used exclusively in funerary contexts during the 12th century, at the height of the Khmer Empire. "This symbol," explained the academic, his eyes alternating between fascination and apprehension, "was engraved on the tombs of prisoners pardoned by the king, those who should have been executed, but who for some reason received royal clemency. The mark meant they were living on borrowed time. Their lives no longer belonged to them, but to the sovereign who had spared them. 2 years have passed since that night in the forest of Angkor Wat. The mark remains, unchanged and indelible. I've tried every possible treatment, medical, surgical, alternative, but nothing affects the black symbol on my forehead. I've completely abandoned my career as a documentarian. I haven't been able to pick up a camera since that night, as if the very act of framing the world through a lens might inadvertently reveal things that shouldn't be seen. Doctors can't explain other aspects of my condition, like the fact that I no longer dream, at least not with common dreams. When I close my eyes at night, I see only the forest of Angkor Wat, the supernatural mist, the spectral monks continuing their endless ritual. As a silent observer, I witness the same ceremony night after night, unable to interact, unable to escape. More disturbing is the cyclical transformation of the mark. With each full moon, the symbol darkens, becoming not just black, but a darkness that seems to absorb the light around it. During these nights, I hear the chanting again, not as memory, but in real time, as if the spectral monks were physically present in my room, continuing their ritual thousands of miles away. Doctors call this an auditory hallucination, a side effect of psychological trauma. But that doesn't explain how I now perfectly understand every ancient Khmer word, a language I never formally studied. It doesn't explain how I know specific details about 12th century religious rituals that aren't documented in any known academic source. And it certainly doesn't explain the others who have begun to appear in my dreams, Westerners like me, each with the same mark on their foreheads, silently observing the nightly ritual like eternal spectators. Some wear modern clothes, others attire from various eras spanning centuries. None of us can communicate directly, but silent recognition passes between us. We are the spared ones, the marked ones, those who live with one foot in each world. Consultations with specialists in Khmer religion revealed a detail that doctors didn't know. According to ancient Cambodian beliefs, the symbol I carry isn't just a mark of clemency. It's a contract. When a Khmer king spared a life, that life belonged to him not just during his mortal existence, but eternally. The pardoned one became part of the sovereign's spiritual court after their physical death. Last night, as the full moon illuminated my room through thin curtains, I heard the chanting more clearly than ever. This time there was a new cadence, a subtle alteration in the melody. And for the first time, the figures in my dream seemed aware of my presence as more than a mere observer. King Suryavarman directed his gaze directly into mine, not across time and space, but with devastating immediacy. His lips formed words that resonated not just in my mind, but through my entire being. The contract is almost fulfilled. When I awoke, the mark had changed. The symbol remained the same, but a thin circle now surrounded it, a circle formed by tiny Khmer letters that, under magnification, revealed a countdown. An ancient lunar calendar marking cycles until some specific date. I consulted another specialist, who calculated when the cycle would complete. Exactly 3 full moons from now. I don't know what will happen when the countdown ends. Part of me fears. Another part, a part that grows increasingly stronger, awaits with a strange anticipation, as if I were finally returning to a home I never knew I had. During the last full moon, I made a disturbing discovery. While examining my reflection in the mirror, I noticed that the mark seemed to pulse subtly, synchronized not with my heartbeats, but with the distant rhythm of the ceremonial drums I could hear only in my mind. When I touched the symbol, my fingers came away covered not with ink or blood, but with a thin layer of mist that dissipated in seconds. During that same night, I had a different vision. Instead of the usual ceremony, I saw myself walking through the forest surrounding Angkor Wat. Not the modern forest, but as it existed in the 12th century. I saw monks working on manuscripts by candlelight, warriors training in hidden clearings, dancers rehearsing ritual movements. No one seemed to notice me, except for an elderly monk who looked up directly at me and smiled in recognition. "Welcome to your training," he said in ancient Khmer, words I understood perfectly. "You will make an excellent chronicler for our eternal court." I awoke with the first rays of dawn, a traditional Khmer calligraphy brush inexplicably in my hand. This is my final confession before the next full moon. I write this as a warning, as testimony. The forests surrounding Angkor Wat contain more than trees and forgotten ruins. They contain a complete royal court that transcends death, time, and reality itself. Monks, dancers, warriors, and their eternal sovereign, continuing their existence in a dimension that occasionally overlaps with ours. And apparently, they're always recruiting. The mark on my forehead darkens each day now. When I look in the mirror, I sometimes see a different face superimposed over mine, not fully formed, but gradually emerging, like a photograph slowly revealing itself in a tray of chemicals. A face from centuries ago, with eyes that knew Angkor Wat in its original glory. Doctors say it's just a scar reacting to light. They are mistaken. It's a portal forming, a gradual transformation, an initiation. On the next full moon, when the cycle completes, I know the monks will come to fetch me, physically, and this time I won't have the option to refuse their invitation. The contract that was sealed with an icy touch to my forehead will finally be fulfilled. I no longer fear this. In fact, I feel a strange peace. I will be a chronicler in the eternal court of Suryavarman II, documenting rituals and ceremonies that exist outside linear time. My modern Western perspective will be valuable to them, just as their ancestral wisdom will be to me. If you're reading this and feel an inexplicable attraction to Angkor Wat, a calling you can't rationally explain, be careful. The forest is always looking for new talents, new souls to add to its eternal collection. And if, during your visit, you spot a Westerner in modern attire walking among the spectral monks in the twilight mist, a man with a circular black mark on his forehead and an ancient calligraphy brush in his hand, don't be alarmed. I'm just doing my job, documenting the true history of Angkor Wat, the history that continues to be written, night after night, by those who never truly left. The creator of this document, Michael Herschel, disappeared from his hotel in Siem Reap 3 days after writing this account. An extensive search found no trace of his whereabouts. The only clue was a single footprint found on a muddy path in the forest surrounding Angkor Wat. A footprint that, according to investigators, began normally but ended abruptly, as if the person had simply vanished in mid-step. Curiously, since then, several visitors to Angkor Wat have reported sightings of a Westerner with a circular mark on his forehead, documenting invisible ceremonies with an ancient writing brush instead of a modern camera. Local authorities attribute such reports to excessive imagination influenced by local legends. The symbol described in this document was identified by specialists as an extremely rare variant of ancient Khmer writing that appears in only one known location, a small hidden frieze in Angkor Wat depicting the personal court of King Suryavarman II, including a figure identified as the foreign chronicler who is yet to come.